Welcome to Bound by Books, a podcast where we talk all things writing and bookish. I'm Tina Moss, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Sherri Hayes, where we're going to talk about diversity in writing and publishing. Controversial topic time.
A little bit controversial. Yeah. Hi, Tina. How are you doing?
Good. How are you today, Sherri?
I'm doing good. So we kind of picked a little bit of a controversial topic to talk about today. Um, Diversity in fiction specifically. If we want to drill down really specifically romance, but I think what we're going to talk about today is really applies to all fiction stories.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's interesting. We're going to acknowledge right away that we are talking from the perspective of two cisgendered women and white women. So that's going to, of course, be our experience. But we're talking about it from a established author perspective. On my side, owning a publishing company and what that means in terms of diversity. So I think we have just a little bit of experience to talk about the topic, but we want to acknowledge that it's coming from that particular perspective.
Which, if you're watching on YouTube, you can kind of see. It's kind of hard to, mask the very paleness that is the two of us.
We are the palest of the co-hosts.
Yeah, I really do. I think so too. Yeah, there's no getting away from that.
I even tried to adjust my lighting before, and I'm like, there's just no getting around this fact that I have no color in my face.
No, I actually have more color now than what I did when I was growing up. So as I've gotten older, I have gotten my skin has gotten a little darker. So that tells you, like, as a elementary school student, how pale I really was.
I think that's important to recognize too, that when we're talking about diversity, of course, we're not just talking about race, we're talking about sexuality, gender, ableism. There's a wide variety of diverse topics within the subject of diversity. So, Sherri, where should we begin?
Let's see. Why don't we start with why having diversity in fiction is a good thing?
Yes, I think that's a great question. Because I think for so long too, we've gotten this idea that in media, not just books, but in all of our media, that the default has been the white male privilege, usually fairly well off perspective, right? And of course we've had different things over the years, but that's been the default standard in most of media.
Yeah, I would say though, even up until probably about 20 years ago, in again, talking from a romance perspective, because obviously that's what we both write, really it was very rare, I mean, to find anything outside of that, either wealthy, especially in the hero perspective, wealthy white man, and he was either A, wealthy, or B, he was a rogue. Like, he was a pirate or some sort of a scoundrel. There was it fit into one of those two categories typically. I mean, there were always exceptions, but typically 99% of it fell into those two categories. The woman obviously was a little bit different, but you did not find a lot of things outside of that. I mean, we're not just talking about race, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about heroes with disabilities, and we're talking even if it was a lisp or a limp or something that is really not overly difficult to write in fiction into a story, but it was very rare to find. I mean, how many heroines or heroes can you think of from the past when we were growing up reading romances that were in a wheelchair?
Right.
I mean, it just didn't happen. I mean, one of our co-hosts, Danielle Bannister, actually has a romance with an autistic character. that's something you would have never really seen, especially in fiction 20, 30 years ago.
Right. I would add, especially in fiction romance and
Mhm.
the heteronormative, male, especially the male hero, like you said, I feel like we got a little more diversity with our heroines, but our heroes were very much, I hate to say carbon copies of each other, but from a
Mhm.
certain archetype of each other. And to be frank, certain stereotypes of each other. And really the biggest thing that I see in publishing today in terms of diversity is that aching need for different types of heroes, different types of heroines, and then different types of authors writing. That's another
Yeah.
thing we can certainly dive into in terms of romance in the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah, it's really actually been quite refreshing to pick up to have at least the option to pick up a story, um, where it's not the hero again, especially the hero,
Yeah,
isn't so cookie cutter.
for
You're
sure.
not just, you're not just going in and being like, "Oh, this hero is this wealthy billionaire who can do everything and it doesn't have any flaws and is like this Adonis." And I mean, it really is refreshing from a reader perspective to actually get that variety because
Hmm.
it's reality. I mean, it's one of the things that I've explored in in my stories. I actually have a hero in Longing for His Kiss who is a war veteran, and he was injured, and so he actually has a limp,
Hmm.
from a leg injury. But again, I could probably name on one hand how many romances I have read that have an injured hero.
Right. Unless it's part of the plot device for them to, overcome that injury in some way,
Right.
which has its own problems to it, because then are you writing a, let's say, disabled hero in this case, or are you writing somebody who's overcoming that and that it's a detriment to them? That's a
Right.
big thing that I find, coming from the disabled community, is if you're going to write a disabled character, they can't have some magical or otherwise fix to their disability,
Mhm.
because then you are, putting down essentially the thing that is making them a diverse character.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it needs to be, if you're going to dive into that diversity with your character, if you're going to have them be disabled or gay or whatever it is, you actually need to embrace that quality and make it part of your character's persona, their story, who they are, because it is. I mean, somebody who has a disability has to live with that disability in a
Mhm.
realistic fashion. And it's called a disability for a reason. There's something about that that does impede them or make it difficult for them to do certain things in life. And
Right.
it may not be an everyday thing. Again, my character in his Forbidden Kiss, he has that leg injury, and it's not something. It's his particular leg injury is not something where it it bothers him 24/7. But if he is on it for an extended period of time, or or he works it too, he works it too hard, it bothers him, and it starts hurting him, and he has a limp. But again, it's that to me that makes the story more interesting because then he has to learn how to adjust and work around it. And in a romance perspective, I actually love reading stories like that because it really does it creates even more plot devices to weave into the story as to how the hero and heroine come together to address and deal with the various challenges. Because if you are with somebody who has a disability, you do have to be honest about what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their limitations? Do you need to make accommodations for certain things? And that's all things that realistically you should be including in your story.
I agree 100%. And I think that's kind of where some of these more controversial questions come in terms of, do we present a realistic picture? And even in the language that we're using, right? We're saying, like, hey, it's called disability for a reason. There is
Mhm.
real life consequences of having these things. Not to say that a disabled person is not a full whole person. That's
Mhm.
ridiculous. But there are real life challenges to it. And so I think one of the questions that comes up with this particular topic is, and I hate to put it in these terms, but this is usually how it arises, is should writers write what they know,
Mhm.
or if they're writing something that is different from their own life experiences, is that okay? Or should we be leaving it to the people who have those real life experiences? What do you think?
Personally, I'm not of the camp that thinks you should stay in, you have to write exactly what you know. Case in point, if that was how things should be, then we would never have murder mysteries because I
Agreed.
don't think that the authors of the murder mysteries are going out and killing people so that they can write good villains.
Absolutely. I mean, I write aliens and vampires and shifters, and as much as I would like to say that I am an alien or that I have experienced, a relationship with an alien, although my husband sometimes could be an alien. I don't think that's actually my real life experience. Now, of course, I am not comparing fictionalized characters to real life people, but there is
Mhm.
something to that idea of staying jumping out of your lane, quite frankly, not staying in your lane and not being one dimensional. Because if that were the case,
Mhm.
then I would only be writing a certain type of character. I wouldn't even be writing male characters because I don't have
Right.
that perspective.
Exactly.
So I really don't like that argument. I understand where it's coming from because I do think we need more stories from disabled writers, from
Mhm.
authors of color, from authors in the LGBT community. We need those diverse voices, but I think to pigeonhole writers into just saying, well, you have to stay within the boundaries of your own life experiences is going to harbor us from having some really great stories.
Well, I also think that it's actually the complete opposite of creativity
Yes.
because part of creativity is creating
Hmm.
something. That's what it means. It's creating something in, not out of nothing, but out of nothing. I mean,
Hmm.
you're taking some raw material, in this particular case, words, a jumble of words, and creating a story with it. And that in and of itself is comes with making things up. But in that same respect, it is, to me, it comes to a matter of respectfulness
Hmm.
and honesty. Um, when I was writing a story about firefighters, I contacted a fire department, and the particular fire department that I was writing about, actually, because I was writing about a specific city's fire department, and I worked with them, and they were great about answering a bunch of questions I had to try to make, it realistic. And that obviously that's a little bit different in the diversity thing, but again, it's kind of isn't, it kind of isn't, because firefighters do encounter certain things and they can get hurt and they can do, they have risks with their job the same way you could, and again, it's just diversifying things, not having your
Right.
characters all be cookie cutter the same. It goes back to that whole Mary Sue argument.
Hmm.
We're told as writers, don't write a Mary Sue. That's really bad.
Right.
It's kind of along the same lines. I mean, your characters should be individuals, just like we're all individuals.
Right.
And, that requires a little bit, again, I think it comes back to the respect issue, not
Yeah.
necessarily anything else. It's just if you're writing something that you're not particularly uh knowledgeable on, just be respectful. There's
Mhm.
plenty of people out there that will help you. They will answer your questions if you don't know. And if you're taking a deep dive, because again, there's differences in when you're writing fiction, you're writing a story, there's also different levels as to how deep you're diving into that diversity. You can have a diverse character and it may play a minor role in your story and you may not need to do a whole lot of research on that. You may just your experience in just life of just encountering different people may be enough for it.
Yeah.
But if they're your main character and you and their diverse aspect of their character is a huge part of your story, you may want to find somebody who actually has more experience with that, whether it is a disability or a sexuality or whatever it is, and do a little more digging. And just again, it's just a matter of being honest and respectful of the situation.
So
And
tangential to that, I have another question that I don't necessarily have an answer to this, but I'm wondering how you feel about it. So I'll give you an example. In Code Black, my
Mhm,
characters are both white, and the heroine is actually bi. I myself am bi, so I'm writing from that experience. However, it almost doesn't come out in the story at all. It comes
mhm,
out in the sequel a very little bit. I kind of tease the fact that she's flirting with another woman in the second book, but it really doesn't come out because the relationship in this particular book is perceived as heteronormative, and I think a lot of bi women who are with a opposite gender partner experience that. But I also have a character who I have very much wanted to write. My entire world in the Paranormal Crime Division series is very diverse. I have a lot of
mhm,
different races. I have a lot of different sexualities and gender identities in there. But I have a character who is a black man. He's a vampire who was turned in the 1800s. So it was around the time of slavery when he was turned. And I
mhm,
very, very much want to write his story because he's such a loud voice in my head.
mhm,
He's such a big part of it. I think readers would love it.
mhm.
But I've always held back from writing it because I'm like, is this my story to write? Because I don't have those experiences, because I have such a
Mhm.
sensitivity to this subject, because ideally it would be a black author who was writing this story, but he's calling so loud to me, and yet I still hesitate for all of these reasons. So here's the question coming in. Do
Okay,
you
okay.
think an author, whether
Mhm.
of one race or another, do you think that they could write a character like that as the main character of that story? Or is that something we should be leaving to authors who match up with that particular story? What do you think?
Okay, let me counter that with another question, and this hopefully will give you my perspective on this. Would you hesitate to write a story about a character with a different sexuality than you, a disability, or anything else? Or is it just because it's a race difference and that happens to be a very hot button topic today?
It's a good question. See, now I just said I'm part of the LGBT community, right? So
Mhm,
I feel okay stepping into those other identities, even though I don't
mhm.
have that experience, because I am a part of that community.
But okay,
Which,
take a disability. Again, we talked about wheelchair
right.
earlier. Would you feel comfortable having, say, a hero or a heroine that was permanently bound to a wheelchair? Would you feel comfortable? Would you ever write that? My guess is yes.
See, now that's a good question
So,
too. But I also have a caveat with that. I have
okay.
never experienced a disability like that. However, I worked almost 20 years in education with
Mhm,
students with special needs, with
mhm,
a very diverse population of disabilities.
mhm,
So, while I have not personally experienced that, I do feel like I have enough insight, again,
mhm,
into that particular community where I would feel more comfortable. Here's where I think the comparison, maybe with like a trans character where I don't have a lot of knowledge about
mhm,
different gender identity like that, I might hesitate. But you're right. I
mhm,
do think because it is specifically a black male character who there's no way I can get around it. At some point, I'm going to have to address the issue of slavery in the American
Mhm.
past. Is a very difficult idea for me to say, as a modern white woman, am
Mhm.
I okay writing this character?
Okay, so we're gonna
Deep
go
dive.
into this a little bit here and deal with this specific thing. My opinion, if it was me in your position, I would do a lot of research
Mhm,
into what his life was like before he was turned.
mhm,
And the reason I say that is because characters, and I don't care if you're a vampire and you've lived hundreds, you are you, what happens to you in the first 20 years of your life so defines who you are. It's
absolutely.
so critical to years. So to me, I would be looking, if I was researching this character, I would be taking a deep dive and researching what his childhood was like, what he grew up, what his mindset would have been there, and then figure out how it would have changed as he became a vampire and things. Because again, in this particular instance, because you're dealing with somebody who is has been alive for a really long time and grew up in the time of slavery, he's not going to be looking at modern times exactly the same way as you know, somebody, even of that same race, would be looking at it in modern times. His
Right.
perspective is going to be completely different. And so if you approach it from that perspective, because again, you could go to somebody who, of that race who is alive today and interview them and do all that, but it's still not going to give you exactly the same perspective because they were not alive back then.
Absolutely.
So I mean, it's not to say to discount what what the modern equivalent is,
Perspective.
but
Yeah.
yeah, the modern perspective it's just again because we all know how much our informative years
Mhm.
affect us. It's going to have, I think that's going to have so much of a things. And to me, I would approach it like you did with working with people with disabilities. It
Mhm.
wasn't you that had it, but you were able to observe it. You were able to, dive into learning about that. And that's why you feel comfortable. So I would approach it the same way. I would approach it as learning about this and taking that information and then incorporating it into your story and character. So yes, I would say go with it, run with it.
Mhm.
I just think maybe again, you're gonna have to do a decent amount of research with it
Right.
to make sure that you do him justice and you completely understand his character and his motivations
Yeah.
before you dive into it. But that kind of brings us to I guess the what not to do in diversity. That kind of is a great segue. You don't you
Tell the
do not
story,
want to
share. You have to share the story that got us on this topic to begin
Oh,
with.
okay, yes. So
Don't say
how
the name
this
of the
topic
book. We're
I
not
will
going
say
to
the name
shoot
of the
down the
book.
book, but
I
you
won't.
have to tell the story of it.
I won't.
What not to do.
Okay. Okay. So, yes, how we came up with this topic, I approached Tina and I was like, okay, I think we should talk about this topic, but I want to because it is kind of controversial. But what do you think about talking about diversity? Because um I I picked up this book. It was a recommendation from a book blogger. Okay. They loved it. They raved about it. So I'm like, okay, I'd never read this author before. So I think, but it was an interracial, autistic hero with and you might have to help me, with
I remember when you were telling me this, it was a grandmother character was introduced, and it
yes,
stated that
well,
she
yeah,
was pansexual
pansexual,
with
yes,
no other, like, essentially
mm-mm.
reference to it at all, just kind of throwing it out there like, hey, I'm pan,
Yep,
basically.
yep,
And the diversity of the characters was so out there that like people like I don't, for example, I don't walk up to the average person on the street and say, "Hey, by the way, got my rainbow flag on, just so you know." That like that
Yeah.
doesn't happen. Like there are certain,
Mhm.
diverse issues that you can't see right away. Like we say
Right.
with race, that you can usually see a person's skin
Mhm.
color. You don't technically know what race they are still, but there's assumptions
Right.
made based on that.
Right.
Whereas with other forms like a disability, you might be able to see it. It might be an invisible disability. But
Right.
with this book, it
Yeah,
was
it was just
over
it
the
just threw it
top.
out. Yeah, it was the two characters were talking, and this was just and the heroine was just like, they were talking about her grandmother, and she's like, "No, she's pansexual." And I'm like, "Okay." And then they kind of went on with the conversation, just completely went in a different direction, but it never came up again. In the
Right.
entire story, it never came up again. And I was like, I kept waiting for them to do something with it. Like, I kept waiting for it to have some bit of relevance to the
Mm-hmm.
story as to why they brought it up. And I'm going, okay. I was confused because, again, I finished the story, read it to the end. And I still kind of was left as what was the reason? And I
Right.
really felt like because there were a few other diversity things that were thrown in there that I'm missing now because we I read this like 2 months ago. But it really did kind of feel to me like the author was ticking off boxes. Like,
Yeah.
"Oh, I need to have this and I need to have," it's like, "Oh, I need to have X number of diversity, aspects into this book." And so got that one, got that one, got that one. Um, so yeah, it kind of felt a
That's so
little.
problematic to me because it goes into this idea of like performative activism or performative social justice, right? We get these ideas of you have to, like you said, you have to check a certain amount of boxes. But that
Mhm,
is just as bad as having
mhm.
no diverse characters in your book. Because
I
if
actually
you're
think
just
it's
gonna
worse in my opinion,
I do too.
personally.
I kind of do because at least with no diverse characters, you're not just throwing them in there for the sake of checking a box, and you're making it. To me, you're diminishing who your character is and
Yeah,
what they're about if you are literally just like, oh, and by the way, there's this, and has no other relevance to the story because they
right,
could be anything, right? They
right.
could be anything, and it
Yeah.
wouldn't matter. So that's not a rich character, and you're
Mm-mm.
just doing it for performativism, which is the worst thing you can do. It has to be genuine. If it doesn't come from a genuine, respectful place, then don't bother.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with diversity in stories. I think it does create more realism, and I'm all about realism in characters. I don't like over the top perfect heroes and heroines. I just don't. That's just not my personal preference.
Hmm.
So to have a little bit of diversity mixed in there is a good thing for me. Now, like everybody, I have my personal preferences as to what types of stories I tend to prefer. Um, but you know, I tend to be a little more open to it as long whatever you're going to throw at me, as long as you support and write a good story around it. But
Hmm.
just throwing something out there and just because, just to make it sound more diverse, just sounds kind of fake to me. Feels kind of
Right.
fake, and
That's
that
exactly it.
I
Yep.
don't particularly like that. and I
Yeah.
and I think unfortunately it almost seems like it is becoming more common in fiction as there's this push to make your books more diverse, to make shows more diverse, to just kind of to push, to get, an increase in diversity. And it's like, okay, well, I don't have enough boxes ticked, so we need to throw this character in there and have them be this way so that we
Right.
can get another thing. And yeah, it's not the right way to do it. If you're gonna do diversity in a story, there needs to be a reason behind it, or at
Mhm.
least have it be pertinent, especially if it's something that it's going to, like, again, this particular same book, the hero was autistic, and his autism was a main part of the story. How awkward
Mhm.
he was, and how he didn't he was very blunt, a lot, and dealing with, and dealing kind of with that, and her, the heroine had some really unique quirks of her own.
Mhm.
Those worked really, really well. But, again, there's
I
ways to
don't
do it and there's not ways to do it. Now,
Yeah, and I don't think that the diverse thing necessarily has to be the central driving point of the
mhm,
story, but I do think that the characters have to be true to that worldview and perspective, right?
mhm,
Because the way one character sees the world is going to be totally different from the way another character sees the world,
right.
and their diversity is going to play into that worldview. So I don't think you necessarily have to tell, the story of oppression if it's something, racially bound or gender identity, or actually any of them. They're all based in different parts of oppression, right? But I don't think that's what the story has to be about, or it doesn't have to be motivated or driven by that. But it is a part of that character's worldview. So I think that's the important part of when you're creating diverse characters, is to make sure that your character doesn't have the same view as another character, even within like the same communities, right? So let's take the Hispanic community, right, or Latino
Mhm.
community, right? They are widely diverse people. Somebody from Colombia is going to have a totally different experience than somebody from Puerto Rico, for example, right? They are
Mhm.
not the same. So I think understanding where a character is coming from is going to be the most important part of having diversity in your books. What do you think, Sherry?
Yeah, having multi-layered characters, I think, is
Yes.
is the best way to introduce diversity into your stories versus just trying to say, "Oh, I need to have a character that is X."
Hmm.
I think just making, because people are multi-layered. Not, I mean, nobody is one-dimensional. I mean, seriously, I've never met a person in real life that is one dimensional. We're not robots here. So just understanding your characters, making sure that they do have multiple layers to them, and that not every character is the same. So, not every character is going to, just like you would pick, like, you wouldn't have every character in your story to have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Hmm.
The same thing, maybe, I mean, we haven't really talked about body image and body
Yes.
types, but that's another form of diversity that I
Huge
don't
one.
think, in the romance genre, you have, the big beautiful woman
Hmm.
as kind of almost like a trope
Yep.
these days. But, you also, you'll have kind of a very finite, for the longest time, it was like you had these petite women
Hmm.
that had just the right amount of curves, and that was all your heroines were like. They were
Hmm.
all like that. They all fit in that box. Now, we are starting to see more, you know, um, tall women. I just finished a book where the heroine was 6 feet tall.
Hmm.
But again, I can count on one hand when the hero on books romances that I've read where the heroine's been over 5'7". Most of the
Right.
heroines are, like 5'2" or 5'4". Um, I also don't see a whole lot of athletic heroines,
Hmm. Hmm.
where they don't have, like, they're not really curvy or what have you. Because you almost have, like, you don't have a lot of, you do have a more now of, again, the plus size women,
Hmm.
which is kind of a new recent, in the last 10 years, development in romance.
Yeah.
But you almost now have that, and then you still have the traditional, like, hourglass figure woman, and then you
Yep.
don't really have the more straight figured, you know, not hugely curvy athletic type woman. You don't see
Mhm.
that very much. So again, that's another form of diversity. And the same with the heroes. Not every hero has to be, you know, built like built like he can bench press a car. Yeah.
Well, clearly
So
I didn't get that memo. I have all abs. If you're watching on YouTube, they're just all ab covers. I totally agree. I think that there is a lot of room for improvement when it comes to the physical features of our heroes. They don't all have to be, bodybuilder esque heroes and to be lovable and to be a romance hero, to be honest. The thing you said about the plus size women got me thinking too, and this is kind of again a side note to our private conversation, but how do you feel as a person who's obviously, putting out books and has to decide on their own covers of having larger women on the covers? Because this has been a heated topic, I feel like, in the book community for a while, in that sometimes the cover does not match the inside. And now, of course, we're getting into
yeah.
marketing, but how do you feel about diversity on covers?
I would love to see um more realistic and I mean again, I'm not talking about hugely, but it would be nice if we had some more, stock image models that were like a size 12 or 14. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that would be absolutely, I'm not asking for miracle, I'm not asking for like huge things here. I'm just asking for, 12, 14. That would be great because you would just at least have something besides the really, again, it's funny because you don't see a whole lot of, again, athletic women in books, in the actual
Mm-hmm.
stories. That's exactly what you see the most of when it comes to covers. And that's
Mm-hmm.
because obviously stock images, that's what most, things. I do actually have one cover that is a plus, well, I don't really call her plus size, but she kind of is. But her name is Kareen,
Mm-hmm.
and she is. I actually, this was a custom cover, so this was a photo shoot I had done. Um,
And this is
but
burning for her
she
kiss.
is, yes, burning for her kiss, and yeah, she's a size 12.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I had to have this cover custom done. Like I had to actually hire a photographer and, find these models and have this shoot done specifically for this cover. Um, but so yeah, unfortunately, if you want to have a
A
plus
mid-size.
size,
Yeah.
yeah, if you
And
want to have anywhere near a plus
12, 14, we're
size
talking
model,
mid-size. We're not even into plus size
oh
for
yeah,
stock photos. So I mean,
yeah,
that's very true. I feel like the stock photos size maybe, size 00 to maybe you get a size 6 woman. Uh,
yeah. I was going to
but
say 6 is probably the
that's
most, and I don't
yeah.
even know if there's that many of them.
And then of course you get into different races, disability. Forget about trying to find a
Mm.
disabled stock photo that's going to be romance cover appropriate. It's almost not going to happen.
Yeah, your best bet, like if you had a character that was in a wheelchair, your best bet is try to find one of the character in a chair, and then have
Mhm.
your cover designer basically change it photo in Photoshop
Yep.
to, to make it into a wheelchair.
Now, the
Which,
argument for all of these things as to why we don't have these types of covers and these stock photos, and why we've had what's called, for those who are not in the industry, whitewashing of covers for so many years, is the argument is that they don't sell as well. I have lots of thoughts. I'm gonna save them.
Mm. Okay. So I think that argument could have potentially held water 20, 30 years ago
Mhm.
because again, most of the books up until that point, even if they were written by people who were not white, um, the heroine were white. There was there was hardly any interracial um at all, let alone having both characters not be white. Um, but again, I would say about 20 years ago, I started noticing that there was a little bit of a shift in that, where I
Mhm.
started noticing more interracial stories peppered in there. I remember reading a story that came out with Harlequin in their Blaze line. Oh, it had to be close to 20 years ago, and it was an interracial couple. So they were out there. But
Right.
again, they were definitely not there wasn't a lot of them.
Well, it also wasn't mainstream. I remember growing up where there
Exactly.
was in the library an African American romance section in my local library because for some reason they couldn't be shelved in the regular romance section, which of course today, like I think about that in cringe. But that was what it was growing up, is that these covers, these books had a totally different category. They didn't even put them
Hmm.
in the main lines. That's how,
Right.
you know, I hate to use the word, but how segregated it
Hmm.
was. Um,
Yeah, I would say it's funny in a way, not funny, haha, but funny,
mhm,
ironic
right.
that romance tends to be, at least today, one of the, in my opinion, the most diverse fiction genres that are out there. But 20, 30 years ago, when you're like what you're talking about, it was so incredibly like anything that was outside of the norm
Mhm.
was segregated out, because I would
Yep.
be willing to bet that not only did they have an African American section, they probably also had a section for all the other
Yeah.
non conforming romances. So, but
Yeah, it was
again,
probably
I
the trash. I mean, I hate to say it
yeah,
that way, but
yeah.
there's to an extent, they weren't even gonna get put on a shelf
Mm-mm,
just because if it
mm-mm.
didn't fit into the mold, into whatever category terms that they had, it wasn't even gonna get shelved. That's how
Yeah.
much it was, othered.
Yeah, and again, I think part of that has to do with the fact that librarians tend to, on the whole, tend to be of an older age.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and I do think that is changing a little bit. You are getting some younger blood in there in the libraries. But again, we're talking 30, 20, 30 years ago. I would say probably the average age for your librarian was probably about 50.
Yeah, I mean, and also that this is also coming down from the categories of the publishers, right? So the basic
Right.
information that's given to libraries, but publishing 20, 30 years ago, and even now to an extent, was largely not diverse. The opposite of diverse. You could look at one
Mhm.
particular type, and that's who you're going to get
But see, I think
in
the
publishing.
indie publishing world is really what has driven the change,
100%.
especially in romance, because we have the ability to publish pretty much whatever we want. Um, it really has driven the industry to allow and to open up the doors for more unique, diverse stories. And again, it doesn't matter what type of diversity we're talking about, it really has kind of just thrown the barn doors wide open and let so many unique stories to be brought to the world. And I think that is such an awesome thing. And that's why I think, kind of back to your question, to answer your
Hmm.
question, I don't think that argument really holds a lot of water anymore.
Agreed.
I really don't, because there are so many diverse stories. My only concern is again, you still are going to come into the situation is there enough from a photographer perspective?
Mhm.
Are there enough stories about, because I am noticing that there are more interracial photographs
Mhm.
on the stock sites.
Yep.
So that tells me that the photographers are seeing that there is enough interest in it that they think they're going to make their money back of enough people using it. Because remember,
Right.
stock sites, they're not just selling one photograph to one author. They're hoping that 100 authors buy their picture, otherwise they're not really going to make a whole lot of money off of it. So when they go and, again, if they take a picture with a hero in a wheelchair, they
Mhm.
need to be fairly confident that they're going to sell, they're going to have at least 50
Yep.
authors or people to pick, to download and purchase that picture. And I think we're heading in that direction, but I don't think we're quite there yet, because and
Yeah.
I think as there's more demand for it and more, there's more diversity in fiction. I think that we'll start seeing more, just like we did with the more interracial picks. I
Yeah.
think as we see more and more stories where authors are kind of demanding that, hey, we can't find pictures, you're going to have some photographers that are going to up and say, there's a lot of the authors are starting to ask for this. Maybe I should be the one to step up and do some of these pictures, because then they're going to buy for me because there's nobody else out there. And then you're going to kind of see, I think, this steamroll. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I think from this perspective, because when I was starting the publishing company, we said, okay, we have to do this from a top-down perspective, right? We have to get industry on board with us first and prove who we are to industry. Then we're going to prove to who we are to authors and then to readers. So it's top-down perspective. But I think in an issue like diversity, you're actually going the opposite way. And I think it has to start with readers. If
Mm-hmm.
readers buy more diverse stories and more diverse covers, authors will write them and the industry will come around to producing them. So the best thing you can do as a reader is to, support your authors who are putting out stories that have diversity in them. And if right now the covers are more object based and you want to see the people in the stories represented on those covers, write to your authors and let them know that. Authors then take that up the chain, because I don't think this is going to come top down. I think this is going to be like a grassroots type of movement where we start to see more diversity on the covers.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But I do think that the tide is changing. Like I said,
Absolutely.
I have really seen, I am starting to see more, even I've even seen a few covers, or not covers, I should say stock pictures, where we do have mid-sized women in them.
Hmm.
They're few, but they do exist now. And again, even as even a few years ago, that just wasn't the case. So I do think we are moving in the right direction, where there is going to be a little more variety available for covers, but we still have quite a ways to go on that. But things are always evolving, and that's a good thing. Well, I think we we covered quite a bit today.
We did.
Oh, well, we're going to wrap things up. I hope you enjoyed our discussion today on diversity in fiction. If you'd like to know more about Tina and I, you can head over to our website, boundbybookspodcast.com, and we will be back next week with an all new topic. Until next time, bye.
Bye.
Wait! Before you go, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and check us out on our website, boundbybookspodcast.com.